The Grand Charleston Hotel, Michelin-starred restaurant, 50 elite guests. Then Hiroshi Takeda entered, 72 years old, Japanese billionaire, one of the richest men in Japan, wearing formal black kimono, reserved for the most solemn occasions. The hotel prepared everything perfectly. Presidential suite, Dom Pérignon, Japanese orchids. But when dinner was served, something went terribly wrong. Hiroshi started speaking, rapidly, in Japanese, getting more and more agitated, pointing at the plate. Then the dining room. Then something no one could understand. His assistant couldn't translate properly. The hotel director was sweating. Chef Thomas was panicking. 50 guests stared in discomfort. 120 years of hotel reputation about to crumble. Then Rachel Martinez stepped forward. 25 years old. Junior waitress. Everyone thought she just cleaned tables. She approached the billionaire and spoke in perfect Japanese. The room went silent. Hiroshi stared at her. Tears filled his eyes, because what he'd been trying to say wasn't a complaint about food. It was a desperate plea, about a woman he'd lost 40 years ago, a promise made under blooming magnolias, and Rachel was about to help him find her. What city are you watching this video from, and what time is it? By the way, if you're enjoying my videos, I'd be so happy if you could subscribe to my channel and like this video. The Grand Charleston Hotel was about to live through the most embarrassing night in its century-long history. Hiroshi Takeda, one of the most powerful billionaires in Japan, was about to abandon the hotel's Michelin-starred restaurant in a fury. The director was sweating cold, the waiters were panicking, and no one, absolutely no one could understand what the elderly gentleman in his formal black kimono was saying. His words in Japanese resonated in the tense silence of the dining room, while 50 elite guests observed the scene with discomfort. The hotel's reputation, built over 120 years, was about to crumble. Then, from the farthest corner of the kitchen, a young 25-year-old waitress, Rachel Martinez, whom everyone considered just the girl who cleaned tables, did something unthinkable. She approached the billionaire and spoke in perfect Japanese. What followed changed not only that night, but the destiny of everyone present. Because what Hiroshi Takeda was trying to say wasn't a complaint about the food. It was a desperate plea that would reveal a secret. Kept for 40 years, Charleston glittered under the golden lights of sunset when Hiroshi Takeda crossed the entrance of the Grand Charleston Hotel. At 72 years old, the Japanese billionaire wore a formal black haori kimono, reserved only for the most solemn occasions in Japan. His face was an impenetrable mask, dark eyes scrutinizing every detail with the intensity of someone who controls empires worth billions of dollars. Director Michael Anderson had prepared everything meticulously to receive the most important guest in recent years, the presidential suite with views of the historic district. 1998, Dom Pérignon Champagne, rare Japanese orchids arranged according to traditional ikebana. 50 years of experience in luxury hospitality had taught him that details made the difference, but Michael couldn't imagine that all those preparations would be irrelevant before what was about to happen. Hiroshi hadn't come to Charleston for business. He had come for something much more personal, something that had tormented him for 40 years and that would explode dramatically that night. At 8 p.m., the hotel's star restaurant was packed. 50 guests from Charleston's high society observed with curiosity the legendary Japanese billionaire seated at the table of honor under the Venetian crystal chandelier that had seen kings and prime ministers pass by. Star chef Thomas Wilson had worked for weeks on a menu celebrating Southern cuisine with Japanese touches: shrimp and grits with sake, red snapper with miso crust, peach cobbler with matcha tea. But when the first course was served, something went terribly wrong. Hiroshi tasted the rice, put down his silverware, and began speaking in Japanese with growing agitation. His assistant Kenji tried to translate something about the flavor, but the words were vague, imprecise, and the embarrassment on his face betrayed his total inadequacy. Michael approached with his perfect professional smile, trying to calm the situation, but Hiroshi continued speaking in Japanese, faster and faster, more and more agitated. His hands trembled as he pointed to the plate, then the dining room, then something no one could decipher. The other guests murmured, discomfort spreading like a wave through the elegant room. Chef Thomas emerged personally from the kitchen, face red with embarrassment, protesting that he had used perfect ingredients and followed the recipe to the letter. But it was evident that Hiroshi wasn't talking about the food. Anyone who understood Japanese would have comprehended that his words revolved around something completely different. 40 years ago. A promise. Charleston. Cherry blossoms. The situation worsened minute by minute. Hiroshi stood up, his voice loud and full of emotion that seemed about to explode. Kenji was literally paralyzed. Michael felt sweat running down his back as 120 years of impeccable reputation were about to crumble before 50. Witnesses from Charleston's high society. It was at that moment that Rachel Martinez did something absolutely forbidden for an employee of her level. She was observing the scene from the farthest corner of the room, where junior waitresses waited in silence to clear tables. She had understood every word of what Hiroshi was saying, and what he was saying was too important to remain silent. With her heart pounding in her chest, violating all protocol, Rachel crossed the room under everyone's incredulous stares. Her brown hair was pulled back in a rigid bun, her waitress uniform perfectly pressed. She stopped in front of the Japanese billionaire and pronounced in perfect Japanese the words that would change everything. The silence that followed was so absolute you could hear the ticking of the antique clock on the wall. Hiroshi Takeda, the unflappable billionaire who had faced economic crises and ruthless rivals without blinking, remained motionless as a statue. His eyes slowly filled with tears. Hiroshi stared at Rachel as if he had seen a ghost. The waitress, everyone considered just a girl who cleaned tables, was speaking his language with a fluency that revealed years of deep study. Michael Anderson was completely lost, watching the scene without understanding how his junior waitress could communicate with the billionaire in Japanese that seemed perfect. With a gesture demonstrating her understanding of Japanese culture, Rachel made a deep, respectful bow. Hiroshi breathed deeply, trying to compose himself. Then, looking at the room full of curious guests and the hotel staff in a state of panic, he made a decision. Michael immediately understood this was much more than a simple diplomatic incident. With his decades of experience, he recognized the authentic pain in the billionaire's eyes. Within minutes, he had accompanied them to the director's private salon, an elegant environment with leather armchairs, an antique library, and views of the illuminated cathedral. In the private salon, served only by Michael, Rachel, and Kenji, Hiroshi finally began to tell the story he had carried inside for 40 years. Rachel translated fluidly for Michael, not only the words but also the emotions that showed through each phrase. It was 1985. Hiroshi was 32 years old and had come to Charleston to study antebellum architecture, dreaming of bringing Southern aesthetics to Japan. One day, in the gardens of Magnolia Plantation, he saw a young Japanese woman sitting under a magnolia tree. She was crying. Her name was Sakura Yamamoto. She was 25 years old and had come to Charleston to study modern dance. But her family in Japan had disowned her for choosing art instead of an arranged marriage. Hiroshi's voice trembled as he continued recounting. He had helped her. He had found her work as an interpreter. They had shared a small apartment in the French Quarter neighborhood. For 2 years, they were inseparable. She taught him to see beauty through an artist's eyes. He promised her that someday they would return together to Charleston as successful people to celebrate their love, under the blooming magnolias. But then Hiroshi's family in Japan had a devastating financial crisis. His father was about to lose the company. He had to return immediately, promising Sakura he would come back in 6 months. Saving the company required 3 years of brutal work. When he finally had time to return to Charleston, Sakura had disappeared. No one knew where she had gone. He left letters everywhere. He hired private investigators. Nothing. She had vanished. Hiroshi had built an empire. He had become one of the richest men in Japan. But for 40 years, every spring when the cherry blossoms bloomed in Tokyo, he thought of her, of what he had promised her, of how he had disappointed her. He extracted from the inner pocket of his kimono an aged letter with a Charleston postmark dated 1987, 3. Weeks ago, it had arrived at his company in Tokyo. Inside was a watercolor, drawing of Magnolia Plantation with 2 figures, under a blooming magnolia tree. On the reverse, written in Japanese with trembling calligraphy, were few words that had made the billionaire's hands shake. A message from Sakura saying she had never forgotten his promise, that she was waiting for him in Charleston, where everything had begun. Rachel's heart raced as she translated. She was here. Sakura was here in Charleston, but Hiroshi didn't know where to find her. He had checked all the hotels, all the addresses he knew. Magnolia Plantation was enormous. He didn't know exactly where she was waiting for him. He only had a few days before having to return to Japan for urgent business matters. That night, he was so frustrated, so desperate that when he saw the flowers on the table, the decorative blooming magnolias, something in him had broken. Eleanor Patterson, the 80-year-old owner of the Grand Charleston Hotel, had entered the salon silently and had heard everything. She gave Rachel permission to dedicate herself completely to the search. If there was a love story to save after 40 years, the hotel would do its part. The next morning, they arrived at Magnolia Plantation. The gardens were magnificent under the May sun, full of families and tourists. Hiroshi stopped beside an old, gnarled magnolia tree, explaining with a broken voice that it was there, right under that tree, where he had met Sakura in 1985. Rachel noticed an elderly woman painting watercolors by one of the fountains. When she asked if she knew a Japanese painter from the 80s, the woman's eyes lit up. Of course she knew her. She worked there every Sunday painting blooming magnolias. She always said she was painting her memories, but she hadn't come in 10 years. She had moved to a nursing home due to health problems. Hiroshi had to sit on a bench. Suddenly he seemed much older. A nursing home could be anywhere, but Rachel refused to give up. Over the next 2 days, they visited 12 nursing homes. In each one, Hiroshi showed the old photograph of young Sakura. But each time the answer was the same. No one with that name was registered there. The night of the third day, with only 24 hours before Hiroshi's obligatory return to Tokyo, the atmosphere was somber. Everyone was exhausted. Hiroshi remained silent, gaze empty, as if something inside him had broken. But Rachel reconsidered the letter. The exact words were, "I'm waiting for you where everything began." They had taken for granted it meant Magnolia Plantation, but what if it wasn't that simple? She stopped short, eyes lighting up. She addressed Hiroshi with growing urgency, asking if he remembered the address of the apartment he had shared with Sakura in the French Quarter. Hiroshi searched his memory, face concentrated trying to bring to light details buried for 40 years. Trad Street, number 17, a small apartment on the 3rd floor with a balcony overlooking the rooftops of the French Quarter neighborhood. Rachel was already standing, determined not to lose a minute. It was 10 p.m. when they crossed the cobblestone alleys of the French Quarter, illuminated by antique lanterns. The neighborhood was alive and vibrant with jazz clubs from which rhythms and melodies emerged. Trad Street was a narrow, picturesque alley with white facade buildings and wrought iron railings. The building at number 17 had a solid wooden door and a rusty intercom with faded names. Rachel began pressing all the buzzers until someone answered, annoyed. After explaining they were looking for information about someone who lived there in the 80s, a different, older voice took the intercom and said she would come down. Mrs. Dorothy, who opened the door, was about 80 years old, white hair and curious black eyes. She had lived there for 50 years and remembered perfectly Sakura, the Japanese painter who inhabited the 3rd floor from 1985 to 1987. Such a kind girl, always with her brushes and colors. When Hiroshi stepped forward with a trembling voice, asking if she knew where Sakura had gone after leaving the building, Dorothy looked at him attentively. Her eyes widened with sudden recognition. He was Hiroshi, the Japanese boyfriend Sakura always talked about, the one who was supposed to return. It was as if time stopped. Dorothy put a hand to her heart, visibly moved, explaining that Sakura had waited for years, going every day to Magnolia Plantation, waiting for him to return. Then, when she lost hope, she had left Charleston. Are you enjoying this story? Leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Now let's continue with the video. But before leaving, she had left a message saying that if anyone ever came looking for her, they should go to St. Philip's Church. There she had left something permanent, something that would resist time. St. Philip's Church was only 5 minutes on foot. They ran through Charleston's night streets as if in a race against time itself. A 72-year-old billionaire, a 25-year-old waitress, a hotel director, a Japanese assistant. The ancient, majestic church was closed at night. But Rachel knew the priest, Father Joseph, who lived in the parish house next door. After knocking insistently and quickly recounting the story to the priest who had opened in his robe, Father Joseph suddenly remembered, about 20 years ago, An elderly Japanese woman had asked permission to paint a small fresco in the side chapel. She had said it was a gift to the church in memory of a lost love. The fresco was still there. He guided them inside the dark church, turning on only a few lights. In the side chapel dedicated to Our Lady of Hope, there was indeed a small fresco, no larger than 1 square meter, painted with extraordinary delicacy and mastery. It depicted 2 figures under a blooming magnolia tree, a man and a woman. Their faces not completely defined, but recognizable in essential features. Below the fresco, in minuscule but perfectly legible Japanese characters, there was a message that Rachel translated with a voice broken by emotion. The words spoke of a promise never forgotten, of a wait that lasted a lifetime, and of an address. Magnolia Gardens Retirement Home, Ashley River Road, 245. An invitation to come before it was too late, signed with a simple S. The silence that followed was sacred. Hiroshi fell to his knees before the fresco, tears running freely down his face. That message had been there for 19 years, waiting for him in silence, in a chapel where no one thought to search. Michael was already on the phone looking for information about Magnolia Gardens Retirement Home. He knew it. It was a luxury nursing home in the West Ashley area, very private. They could get there in 20 minutes. The car ride through nighttime Charleston was surreal. Hiroshi sat in the back seat, clutching the photograph of young Sakura, eyes fixed on emptiness. Fear was palpable in the car. What if Sakura hated him for abandoning her? What if 40 years were too many? Rachel, sitting beside him, held his hand in silence, a gesture of comfort that transcended cultural barriers. Without words, she tried to convey that a person doesn't paint a fresco of love if they hate. They paint it if they still love desperately. Magnolia Gardens Retirement Home was an elegant 19th century building, surrounded by a century-old park. At 11 p.m. it was obviously closed, but Michael had already called the director, Dr. Ann Stevens, explaining the urgency of the situation. She was waiting for them at the entrance. A woman about 50 years old with an expression between perplexed and moved. A 40-year love story was like a movie coming to life. She explained that Sakura Yamamoto, though there everyone knew her as Sarah Morgan, the name she had legally adopted in the 90s, had been a resident for 10 years. She was 71 years old. She suffered from heart problems and arthritis, but mentally she was lucid. She was one of the most beloved residents. She spent her days painting small watercolor works that she gave to the staff. She always spoke of a man she had loved when young, of a promise made under a magnolia tree. She guided them through quiet hallways with marble floors and paintings on the walls, stopping in front of a door with a plaque. Room 217, Morgan. It was late. She was probably sleeping, but for something like this, it was worth disturbing. She knocked delicately, no response. She opened the door slowly. The room was dark except for a small lamp on the nightstand. In the bed, a thin figure slowly turned her head. When the light illuminated her, Hiroshi felt his breath block in his throat. 40 years had passed. Black hair had turned gray, face marked by time. But the eyes, those deep, dark eyes, were exactly the ones he remembered. The eyes that looked at him crying under the magnolia tree at Magnolia Plantation in 1985. Hiroshi crossed the room and fell to his knees beside the bed, taking Sakura's fragile hand in his. The words that followed were in Japanese, but the emotion was universal. Apologies for all those years, explanations of how he had searched desperately for her, promises never to leave her again. Sakura cried, tears running down her wrinkled cheeks. She had waited so long, had thought he was dead, that he had forgotten her. But he had never forgotten her, not a single day. She had lived in his heart every moment for 40 years. Rachel, Michael, Kenji, and Dr. Stevens had retreated in silence to the hallway, giving the reunited lovers the privacy they deserved. Through the half-open door they could hear the conversation in Japanese. Words of apology, of love, of regret, of joy mixed in a river of emotions too long repressed. Sakura recounted how she had continued painting after his departure, how she had waited 3 years before understanding that perhaps he would never return, but she hadn't been able to leave Charleston. It was the city where they had been happy, so she stayed, changed her name to facilitate her stay. She worked as an art teacher, exhibited in small galleries. She never returned to Japan because she didn't want to be far from the place where they had made their promise. Hiroshi confessed he had built an empire that was empty without her. He had married a woman chosen by his family. They had had a son, but the marriage was cold without true passion. His wife had died 5 years before. His son now managed the company. He was finally free, but had thought it was too late. Sakura's voice, fragile but firm, resonated in the night's silence. It was never too late for true love. He was there now, and that was all that mattered. Dawn found Hiroshi still sitting beside Sakura's bed, their hands intertwined, talking about 40 lost years and the days that remained. Dr. Stevens entered discreetly with coffee, explaining delicately that Sakura had serious heart problems and needed constant care. She couldn't travel long distances. Hiroshi didn't hesitate for a second. He would stay. His assistant Kenji could manage the company remotely. After 40 years chasing success, it was time to chase what truly mattered. When Sakura protested weakly, saying he couldn't abandon his life for her, Hiroshi responded with a firmness that admitted no discussion. That time he had chosen family and duty. This time he chose her. He chose love. In the following days, Charleston witnessed something extraordinary. Hiroshi canceled his return to Japan, sending shockwaves through the Japanese financial world. He rented a permanent suite at the Grand Charleston Hotel, not because he needed to live there, but because he wanted to honor the place and the people who had made his reunion possible. Every day, from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m., Hiroshi sat beside Sakura at Magnolia Gardens. They talked, laughed, cried, recovering 40 lost years. He told her about life in Japan, how technology had changed the world. She showed him her paintings, hundreds of watercolors of blooming magnolias, painted year after year like a silent prayer, an expectation that had never extinguished. Rachel visited often, bringing fresh flowers and news from the hotel. She had developed a deep bond with both, becoming almost an adoptive daughter to the reunited couple. The two elderly people communicated increasingly without need for words. They had developed a language made of looks, of smiles, of hands that squeezed with a tenderness that hurt to watch. 2 weeks after the reunion, Hiroshi organized something special. With Rachel's and Michael's help and an army of gardeners, he transformed the garden at Magnolia Gardens. The existing magnolia trees were cared for and pruned with Japanese mastery, and he waited patiently for the right moment to arrive. At the end of April, miraculously, the magnolia trees bloomed in their maximum splendor. A carpet of white petals and the aroma of azaleas transformed the retirement home's garden into a southern paradise intensified, a piece of dream finally made real. That day, with the doctor's permission and under strict surveillance, Sakura was brought outside in a wheelchair. She wore a blue kimono that Hiroshi had given her, gray hair pulled back with a mother-of-pearl comb. Hiroshi wore his formal black kimono, the same one he had worn that night when everything began at the hotel restaurant. Under the blooming magnolia trees, surrounded by petals falling like perfumed white snow, before 50 moved witnesses, the hotel staff, the residents of Magnolia Gardens, Father Joseph, Mrs. Dorothy from Trad Street, the elderly painter from Magnolia Plantation, and even Chef Thomas, who was crying openly. Hiroshi and Sakura pronounced the vows they should have exchanged 40 years before. It wasn't a legal marriage. Both were too elderly and ill to worry about bureaucratic documents, but it was real in all the ways that mattered. Father Joseph blessed their union. Magnolia petals continued falling like natural confetti offered by nature itself, and for one perfect moment, two souls separated for 40 years were once again one. In the months that followed, Hiroshi completely transformed his life. He sold much of his empire, keeping only enough to guarantee financial security for his son and heirs. The rest he donated to artistic and cultural foundations that promoted exchanges between Japan and America, building bridges between the two cultures that had shaped his love story. He created a scholarship called the Sakura Scholarship for young Japanese artists who wanted to study in America, and established that the Grand Charleston Hotel would forever have a Sakura suite, a room reserved free of charge for 1 week per year for couples, reuniting after long separations. Rachel received an extraordinary promotion, becoming the hotel's director of international relations. Her linguistic talent and cultural sensitivity were finally recognized. Eleanor Patterson, the owner, joked that she never would have imagined that hiring a waitress who spoke Japanese would save not only a love, but the very soul of her hotel. 18 months after the reunion, on a spring afternoon when the magnolias were blooming again, Sakura fell asleep for the last time. Her hand was clutched in Hiroshi's, a smile of absolute peace on her face. There was no pain in that moment, only the serenity of someone who had finally completed the circle of their own life. Hiroshi lived another 3 years, each day spent in the garden under the magnolias, painting watercolors of magnolia blossoms. He had learned from Sakura, and each brushstroke was a way to keep her alive in his memory. His last will was to be cremated, and his ashes scattered under the magnolia trees at Magnolia Gardens alongside Sakura's, so they could finally be united, forever in the place they had transformed into a temple of their love. The Grand Charleston Hotel hosted a commemorative ceremony that united Japanese and American rituals in perfect harmony. Rachel read a letter that Hiroshi had written before dying, words that spoke of how true love isn't measured in years lived together, but in years remembered. Sakura had lived in his heart for 40 years of separation and for 18 months of reunion. Every day had been worth living. The lesson he wanted to leave was simple but profound. Don't let duty, fear, or time separate you from whom you love. And if you are separated, never stop searching. Because even after 40 years, love waits under blooming magnolias, patient and eternal as the spring that always returns. Give a like if you believe true love can wait a lifetime. Comment if you've had an encounter that unexpectedly changed everything. Share this story of waiting, loss, and miraculous reunion. Subscribe for more stories that prove destiny works in mysterious ways. Sometimes a foreign language isn't just words, but a bridge to lost souls waiting to be found. And sometimes 40 years of waiting are worth every second when finally, under blooming magnolias, love finds its way home.